In this video, I'm going to show you how to master the basic watercolor techniques that you need if you're starting off with watercolors. Hola, hola friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Ingrid from My Inner Palette. But before we jump into the practice, I wanted to say thank you to each one of you. Everyone that is watching my videos, everyone that has subscribed to my channel, everyone that has liked the videos or left a heartwarming message. It means a lot to me, and I really appreciate each one of you. So without further ado, please follow me into the practice. So let's start by reviewing the art supplies you're going to be needing for this practice. First of all, you're going to be needing watercolor paints. You can choose from pans or tubes as the ones that I'm showing in the video. I'm gonna be going with the tubes because one of the demonstrations that I want to do, it's easier to demonstrate with tubes. To do the outlines on your watercolor paper, you have different options. If you're using a pen, just make sure that the pen is waterproof, like the pigment liner that I'm showing there, and that is the one that I actually use to make the circles, triangles, squares, etc. And if you don't have one of those available, you can always go with a Sharpie, as long as it's waterproof like this one. And if you don't have any of those, you can still go with a pencil or one of these ones that I don't know the name in English, unfortunately. Just make sure that you have an eraser with you. And cotton buds, they're not 100% necessary, but I always keep them at hand just in case I need them for something. Another thing that is very useful is having a dropper, because this one I use sometimes to grab clean water and put it onto my palette, which makes it much easier than using your brush. Next on our list of favorites, we have a round brush. This one is a rather small one, number 4, because I'm not going to be covering bigger surfaces. Also, it's very useful to have a paper towel, and of course, we need a watercolor paper. Before you start your practice, make sure that you're copying the same pattern that I have on my watercolor paper. And what is watercolors without water? So you need a couple of glasses of water, one for your clean water and the other one for the dirty water, the one that you're going to be using to clean your brushes. Alright, let's jump straight in. So first of all, we're going to be needing to dump the brush into the clean water, and then we're going to start activating our watercolors with the water. So here I'm just drying the excess of water, so I don't want dripping coming from my brush, so I'm just like getting rid of that excess of water. But essentially what we're doing is putting the water onto dried watercolors that I had in my palette to activate them. So here you're gonna be creating a little bit of a puddle. So I'm grabbing a little bit more water with the brush and putting it onto the paint, so it gets a little bit more diluted in the solution with the pigment. If you want to dilute the solution further, you can even grab a dropper and just put a couple of drops of water onto the pigments that have been dried, and this way you're going to start activating them, as you can see in the video. And now it's just getting the right ratio of water and pigment that I want for this painting. But because it's a beginner video, I don't want to get too technical with that, and whatever dilution you have is gonna be fine for this practice. So first of all, we're gonna start with the wet on dry. So what it means is that the dry is the paper is completely dry, and we're applying a wet solution on top of the paper, as you can see now. One important thing to keep in mind when painting wet on dry is that you want to move rather quickly when you're painting, and you don't want the border to dry before you keep on painting. So you are trying to move throughout the circle in a quick way, making sure that the edges of the paint that you have are not getting dry before you apply the paint and complete the painting. Now you can see that I'm cleaning my brush in the dirty water glass, and then taking water from the clean water, taking the excess off the edges of my brush, and I'm gonna go for a second color, which is blue. And now we're gonna be painting the triangle, and we're gonna be using exactly the same technique, so I'm not gonna explain it again, but this is a chance for you to start painting different shapes, because every time that you're practicing, you're getting better. And painting a circle is different than painting a triangle or painting a square. So I would highly recommend that you try different shapes, and we have the outlines here so you can follow them. But even if you want to do it without any type of outline, it's a really good practice and exercise to do as a beginner in watercolors. Practicing with the different colors that you have available is gonna allow you as well to look into the water ratio and pigment that you have and see how the paints that you have at home are working for you. Because you might be using a different type of brand, and that's completely fine, but it just means that your paints are gonna look different or they're gonna react differently, and this is a chance for you to test them out. And now I'm preparing the yellow by adding a couple of more drops of water and hydrate and dilute the pigment that I had already on my palette. And you can see that we're following the same type of technique. Just be mindful of trying to always keep wet the edge of the paint and just keep on moving with your brush forward instead of like coming back, because the first part that you start painting is gonna start drying earlier on than the latest part that you're painting. So in this case, the left side of the square is gonna dry slightly faster or earlier than the last bit that I'm painting right now in the video. Every time that you finish working with a color, remember to clean it in your dirty glass of water, and then taking some clean water from the clean water glass. And now we're gonna start with the second technique called wet on wet. This, you need to add wet paint onto a wet surface. So for that, we are adding clean water onto the surface that we want to paint. So in this case, the circle. And as you can see, I'm only grabbing clean water from the clean water glass jar and adding it to the whole circle, making sure that the whole surface has been wet with the water. Once you have done that, you want to grab paint from your paddle from a color that you like. In this case is this really nice green, and we're gonna start adding it on top of the wet surface, and you're gonna see that how the paint reacts is quite different to the previous technique. When we were dragging the paint across here, you can see that by adding some paint onto the wet surface, this starts bleeding into different shapes, and it looks very cool. And it allows you as well to start adding different colors to the mix and letting them react and act with each other in different ways. So this is a time that you can be creative and just go with your gut, try different colors and see how they blend together, how they react and act with each other, and see what the outcome is. And the wet on wet technique for me is one of the most mindful techniques that you can use, because it's so mesmerizing how you can see the colors blending in, the colors grabbing different shapes and bleeding out into the water. I just find it very relaxing. So even as a mindful practice, if you don't know what to paint, just go wet on wet. There are a couple of other things that you could be doing when you're working with the wet on wet technique, but I'm gonna keep it simple for this practice, considering that these are just the basic watercolor techniques. In a next video that I'm preparing, I'm gonna be showing you some other different techniques that you can use when you're working with wet on wet technique. Another thing to be mindful of when working on wet is that the colors will blend with each other. So if you're looking into a color wheel, try to keep them closer to each other. So within the color wheel, for example, you have the green, the yellow, and the blue. They're closer together into one side of the color wheel. If you go completely opposites, let's say you would use a red and a green, in watercolors they are gonna mix and they're gonna create a color that is more like muddy, brownish, let's say. And if you don't know how a color wheel looks like or how to create one, make sure to check into the description box, and I will leave you there a link to a class on how to make a color wheel with the 3 primary colors, which is red, yellow, and blue. And now for a couple of minutes, I'm just gonna leave you with my process of painting the triangle and then the square, which I'm gonna be using exactly the same wet on wet technique, so that you can see how I use the brush, how I paint, and all of this nuances. Because when I was starting to paint with watercolor, observing other people painting was the most insightful of all. So I'm just gonna lead you with the process, so you might learn something just by observing what I'm doing. And if after watching this video you have any questions, just make sure that you're leaving them into the comment section so I can have a look at them and have the chance to reply to them. we're moving on to the dry on wet technique. And if you think about it, on wet means on a wet surface. Dry means that the paint is gonna be dry rather than wet as it was in the wet on wet technique. So for this, the first step is to hydrate, or let's say cover with clean water all the surface of the rectangle. Once you have finished and gotten from one edge to the other of the rectangle, covering it with water, just make sure that the first bit that you have covered with water first might have started drying already. So just make sure that you re-water it once more, just to make sure that the whole surface is wet. For this technique, I'm gonna be using paint that comes pretty much directly from the tube. So this is why I've chosen the tubes rather than the pans. You can do it with the pans, and you just have to be careful on how much water you're adding to the pan. So the idea is to have the least water content on your mix when using this technique. And now you can see that I haven't diluted it with water. I'm just gonna go straight onto the wet surface and look at how it bleeds. This is just amazing. Next, I will be using the ochre color that I have in my palette already, which has dried, so all the water content has evaporated from it. So it's gonna be looking pretty similar to how a pan would react into this technique. So I'm trying to add just a tiny little bit of water to try to activate the pigment of the watercolor again before putting it onto the wet surface. But you can see that the reaction of the paint going onto the wet surface is not as dramatic as the red that we used previously. And now we're gonna be moving to the wet on dry technique. I know that we had a wet on dry before, but this one, it's meaning wet on dry paint. So here again, I'm gonna be using paint straight out of the tube, and I'm just splattering a little bit of the paint onto the dry surface as well. And we're gonna be calling this paint dry just because it has really small content of water on it. And you can just be crazy, just add some splatters of different colors if you have this paint. Otherwise, if you're using a pan set, just try to do exactly the same as I did before. Just add a tiny little bit amount of water, and then you add it with your brush onto the paper, the least diluted as possible. And once you're ready with that, we're gonna go into the fun part. We're gonna be using the clean water on our brush. I'm gonna be using a different brush for this one, a one that is a little bit bigger and can hold more water than the little one that I was using before. And now we have fun. We go right on it. We start adding water really close to where the paint is, and then we can just do crazy shapes. You just experience with it, have fun. I'm not gonna tell you here what to do. You just go and do it and see how the paint react and blend with each other as well. It's very cool. And if you get the chance to try this, please let me know how it goes in the comments. And you might be able to see that different paints bleed differently when they're in contact with water. And this is also not to do with the brand itself, it's just that different colors and different pigments, they react differently with water. So that's totally normal. Not all the paints are gonna bleed exactly the same. Now I'm gonna show you two different ways of lifting paint while they're still wet on the surface. So first of all, we're gonna be using pretty much the wet on dry technique, the first one that we practiced today, to fill in the circle. And after that, we're gonna be using, in a first instance, paper towel to lift off paint. And with this, we can create a different effect that you can just use as a cloud or something different, if you will. Be mindful that for this we need the whole surface to be wet, so this is why I'm sort of like rebrushing the parts that might start getting a little bit dry. So I'm just making sure that everything is wet again before trying to lift the paint with the paper towel. So the idea now is that you grab a piece of paper towel and you crumple it like I'm doing now. And after that, you start soaking in the paint little by little by dumping it onto the surface like that. And as you can see, it starts looking like, oh, some clouds in that sky or something like that. You can also do what I'm doing there if you have like excess of water in some part of your paint, and in that case you can just try to lift the excess water. So here I'm just adding a little bit more extra water to do the demonstration, but it's not the best practice to rewater your surface after a while. But here you can just do that as well. And the other thing that you can also use, it's a cotton bud like this one to lift some of the paint. Every time that you use one of these different techniques, it's gonna give you slightly different type of result. So make sure that you're trying it all out and see what you like, what you don't like, and let me know if you have any questions. And moving on to how to lift paint with a brush. Pretty much the same. We're gonna pick, just for demonstration, a different color, and we're gonna do the wet on dry technique onto the paper. When painting with watercolors, accidents happen, and sometimes you might have too much water onto your painting and you wish you didn't. to try to fix something like this is where you can start lifting paint with your brush. So for that, the ideal is that you clean your brush, then you dry it with a paper towel, and then you start lifting off the paint and drying it on the paper towel. This can be useful to get any type of excess of water that you have, but also to give different type of highlights to a paint that you would like to do. So here I've gotten rid already the excess of water, but what I'm doing is just keep on going to give some type of different shading to this circle. And as an extra tip, you see all the splatter that I did outside of the circle? Yeah, that happens too when you're working with watercolors. Sometimes you splash something that wasn't meant to be there. And for that, you can also use a clean brush with clean water, and you can re-wet the surface where the splatter went on, like I'm doing here, and then with a clean paper towel, you can just dab it on top of it and absorb that pigment, and voila, you get rid of spots that you didn't mean to put on your painting. And just as a recap, what you've learned today is the wet on dry technique, the wet on wet technique, the dry on wet technique, and also the second wet on dry technique. Plus, you've learned how to lift paint with a paper towel and with a brush. And before we finish this class, I'm just checking that the surface of the practice on wet on dry technique, if they're dry enough or not, because I would like to show you one extra technique. From the three shapes, the square is the one that is the driest. So I'm gonna try with that one. And this will be only a short demonstration of the technique called glazing, but all about glazing will be in a different video. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure that you are subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet. Remember to like the video and share with your family and friends. And also make sure to look into the description box, because I'm gonna leave you some links to other videos that might interest you in your watercolor journey. Have a lovely day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and see you next time.